Journalism with the Boys, Chapter 2, Artist Statement, JT, which stands for Jack Taffety. Alrighty. I'll try
Amen.
not... Amen, brother. I'll try not to die. Okay.
You got this.
I don't. The next club meeting wasn't until a week later, and it was still boring as hell. Because Jack was president now, he had to do the incredibly monumentous task of writing down name and email on a scrap piece of paper for members to sign in. The same 3 people came as last time again. Harlow seemed optimistic that new people would come, but no one did. Jack wasn't surprised, as the club sounded completely and utterly boring. So far, it had lived up to being a total waste of time. Mr. Harlow also suggested he sit up in the front with everyone else. It wasn't a radical change, but Jack still preferred sitting back where he had enough personal space. Dakota scooted his chair over politely, giving him a bit more space in the seat next to him. Jack just sat and slouched down in his new spot. The first half of the meeting wasn't very interesting. Mr. Harlow gave more concrete dates for future service events and talked about what the events would entail. Most of them just listened and nodded along, but Dakota legit pulled out a pen and started taking notes. Was this dude serious? Even the way he wrote was uptight. He couldn't believe this guy. After getting through the exceedingly boring part, they got to the somewhat less boring part.
So, what is it that every journalist should have on hand?
Mr. Harlow asked. Courtney immediately spoke up, his energy radiating across the room. Something to write down stuff in. Mr. Harlow nodded.
Yes, but what else? Integrity?
Dakota guessed like an absolute loser-ass bitch.
Yes to that too, but I'm looking for something else more important.
Mr. Harlow said. Hugo raised his hand tentatively.
An artist statement. Yes.
Harlow confirmed.
If we're going to create articles for this year's Reverence Journal, you should all have an artist statement ready to use.
He went on to explain what they needed to have in the statement, writing on the whiteboard his points until he let them loose to get to work. Jack and Hugo just started writing on their phones like sensible folk, while the other 2 decided to go for their laptops. Courtney pulled out the fanciest looking MacBook Pro with disgustingly colorful stickers plastered all across it, while Dakota pulled out practically the exact opposite. His laptop had to be on its last legs, and Jack was surprised when it turned on at all. Jack just rolled his eyes and minded his own business. After half an hour of typing, Harlow urged them all to share what they had wrote. He had created a group on the website their school used for homework, which would allow them to share posts amongst each other privately.
Hugo Van Dier, a student at South Central Community College, is currently working towards his associate degree in journalism. From a young age, he enjoyed reading video game reviews from the margins of magazines and eventually found his home in online reviewing communities. Hugo now spends most of his time finding his new materials to review for his modest size of growing followers. His subjects of review are unpopular movies and indie video games, though has spread his interests to further reach the popular culture of today. Hello, Hugo. You did an excellent job on your artist statement. Perhaps you could specify more on your pop culture interests, as now it is left rather vague. Perhaps giving examples could help.
I love your post. What's your blog name? I'd love to read your stuff. I think it's good you have a variety of interests to write about. Good post. You write very descriptively, which would be useful in the club's future. As a student of South Central Community College, Courtney Dodger is soon to graduate with his associates in science before transferring to pursue a career in STEM. He participates in many clubs and helps the community through SCCC's Art Club, SCCC's Gaming Club, South Charlton Civitan, and now SCCC's Journalism Club. After having a health scare at a young age, he decided to live life to the fullest and has spent most of his time trying new things and exploring new places. Courtney enjoys writing about a variety of things, though enjoys many subjects, specifically in the fine arts and STEM fields.
Your artist statement gives a good view of who you are and what you're interested in. I'm not sure if, after having a health scare at a young age, part is integral to your post, though. Hello, Courtney. Your personality comes out for your post very well. I think it will be best to not put SCCC in front of every club and instead say through SCCC's Art, Gaming and Journalism Club, as well as the SC Civitan.
Your post is a bit wordy and could use with being more to the point. Other than that, it touches on good points.
Dakota Delagar is soon-to-be graduate from South Central Community College, SCCC, with his associate in business. He is very business-oriented and never had much time for hobbies outside of academics. Developing a strong work ethic at a young age, he can get work done quickly without becoming distracted. While he doesn't have experience as a journalist, he rather enjoys reflecting on his historical subjects and seeing how past events could still show their effect in the modern day. He particularly enjoys early 1900s US history.
Your post sounds more like a resume than an artist statement. Loosen up and talk more about your interests.
Your writing is very professional, but I think it used some more personality in it. Perhaps talk about the specifics of history you enjoy.
Ooh, you sound so thoughtful. I think you'd be great with doing historical research stuff. Jack Taffney will graduate from South Central Community College in the coming spring. His interest in politics has shaped his life and predominates most of his interests. His interest encompasses not only U.S. politics, but also the politics of local government and foreign countries. Aside from politics, Jack also appreciates the history of wars and the weaponry used to win them. Journalism is a natural field for Jack to enter, as he can use the medium as a way to share his political ideas and spread them to others.
Hello, Jack. Your post is very eloquently structured. You come off as very aggressive in the latter half of your statement, which may turn away some readers.
Yo, you're interested in cool weapons too? I love to learn about bombs, and it's part of what got me into STEM. I used to want to be a chemist because I didn't know what mustard gas was, lol.
Your artist statement is well written, and I think it benefits from your bluntness. You also say politics a lot. I suggest finding another word to replace some of it sometimes.
And that was chapter 2. Alright.
Wow, I was surprised exactly how much both Courtney and Jack swore during this chapter.
So much cussing. I'm so sorry. So mature. I should put a age restriction on this.
Rated mature.
Rated R.
Can't believe it.
Yeah. I have a... God, every time I mess up, I can't help just be like, blah, 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 or just like, Jesus Christ. It's just like instinct. Yeah. I gotta stop doing that.
I've learned to just
move on.
I feel like I've just learned to like move on, just be like, even though there in my mind there are at least 6 or 7 times I said a word differently than what it was on the page, or I just missed out a word, but I just kept plowing on. Just kept plowing on because, you know, if the reader's reading this, they're not going to wait up for me.
Yeah.
So they're not.
Yeah.
So.
I think that's a viable strategy. All right.
Thank you. I think so too.
What did we think about this chapter as a whole?
Well, I don't know what we thought, but I can tell you what I think.
Okay, what do you think?
I thought this chapter was admittedly quite short.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're quite aware of this about this chapter, but it was quite short. That being said, it was a very good, I would call it a very good character study. Ooh. So when posed with these artist statements that each of the characters has to do, it's a good opportunity, not just for the characters to tell each other about themselves, but for the readers to get to know a little bit about each of the characters. And as the reader, I find it was a lot more easier to get an understanding of the sort of dynamic that each of these 4 characters have. Unfortunately, Mr. Harlow didn't do an artist statement.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Disappointing
to keep
because
this content from you.
I feel like a journalism club teacher should sort of lead by example. So
I guess I could have put Mr. Harlow's artist.
I feel like I think you did it on purpose. I think what you're establishing early on, or at least what my headcanon is that Mr. Harlow is not nearly as good of a teacher as people think from the first chapter, and I think that's going to be revealed more and more throughout the story as it goes along.
I guess we'll have to keep that headcanon or that theory in mind and see how it
Yeah,
goes.
it's certainly a theory, so it
Yeah.
is. Um, but yeah, it was really good getting to know each of the characters. You know, I I still admittedly don't have much of a understanding of Hugo just yet. He
He's baby.
seems he seems very he seems very much like a model student. I initially thought that that might have been Dakota, though unlike Dakota, who is good at what he does but doesn't quite,
Give a shit.
enjoy it. Hugo Hugo is both a model student and is quite comfortable with being a model student,
Mm-hmm.
whereas Dakota, feels like he has to, for whatever reason, he has to do this or he has to do that.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's one way in which you could differentiate between the two characters.
Yeah, it's
Um,
like Hugo's there because he wants to do journalism, and Dakota's only there because Mr. Harlow asked him, and then he got roped in being
exactly.
vice president. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel like we learned a little bit about Hugo, but not very much,
Yeah.
admittedly. Um, Obviously, and I personally feel like this is true, in most cases about people doing artist statements. But I
Mm-hmm.
feel like people talking about their hobbies when you don't know them very well tends to be a bit of padding, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because if I was in the class and Hugo was telling me how he enjoyed reading video game reviews,
You
that
wouldn't give a
admittedly would be,
shit.
well, that's probably a bad example because video game reviews is possibly something that would quite interest me to see something from a fellow student.
Yeah.
But most of the other cases where it's talking about history or so on, I really wouldn't care, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I suppose it gives a little bit of insight into each of these characters by showing their interest, but not very much.
Yeah.
Um, Still, it very much reinforces the contrast that each of these characters have and the sort of way these characters think. I think a good example was by seeing it from Jack's perspective, you see a slight difference in perspective of, because
He's
Jack
rude.
is showing that he's clearly not interested in this at all. And sure, Dakota's not very interested in it, but Jack is just really like he's just thinking this is just completely stupid. So he does, and you can
Yeah.
see that in the start. So I think that's another good point from the chapter is because it is quite quickly in this story we're seeing different perspectives,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's really helpful for getting to know the main characters.
Yeah. I think writing from the different characters' perspectives is probably one of the most fun parts. Like when you get Dakota, it's like this is what is happening, and then for Jack, like at one point he just calls Dakota a loser ass bitch in his head, and then he goes on this big old diatribe about how Dakota's poor and Courtney likes flashy things, and he's like, oh, but that's none of my business. Like, shut the fuck up then. It's like one of the best parts. I loved writing Jack chapters because he's just such an asshole. I like this chapter too. In the first two chapters, it was a lot of going off of my experiences in college, like talking about how shitty the campus is, and like how confusing it is. And then in this chapter, talking about writing artist statements and the being the president. I was the president of a club in college, and what I had to do was I had to write down name and email on a piece of paper for people to sign in, and then I'd be like, okay guys, this is what's happening. And that was Mr. Harlow because Jack doesn't really know what's going on just yet, but yeah, it was a lot going off of experiences. Also with the artist statement, because I've had to write like 10,000 of those being an art student, and so like just going off of reading what I've had to read from my other students or my peers, I suppose. And this is like a different kind because this is for being a journalist and not being an artist. But I did sort of take from my experiences to try and write what they would write. Yeah. Okay. So, you talked about Hugo Van Deer earlier. What do you think about the characters in general?
So in general, um, So I think I covered Hugo quite well.
Yeah.
As far as how Dakota's developed, I feel a little bad for Dakota. It's clear that he's quite hard up, and I think it quickly explains, this sort of mindset that he has of being overbearing, because he's obviously he's not in much of a privilege to not be
Yeah.
overbearing,
Yeah.
in order to stay afloat. So that's unfortunate. Um, Courtney, I think I don't think I learned much about Courtney this chapter
Yeah.
in, you know, relative terms. Obviously I learned quite a bit about all of them, but um one thing that I'd probably point out is that for one, Courtney is by contrast quite rich, and I think it's interesting to see that you've sort of moved away from the sort of stereotype that rich people tend to be quite snooty, or their privilege shows, because Courtney is
Yeah.
such a nice person,
Yeah.
which you don't often see for someone with such a high up background as he does. And another thing is that for someone quite bubbly and positive, you might not necessarily relate these two characteristics, but I would assume that Courtney is also quite intelligent,
Ooh.
especially
You
because,
would?
especially from the fact that he's had an interest in STEM. So
Yeah.
I feel like to be doing
Okay.
that sort of stuff makes you kind of smart,
Okay,
and analytical.
that is valid, I will say. No, what about Jack? Jack Taffety.
Jack's was quite interesting because we got to see his perspective. So I feel like we learned the most about him. It sort of reinforces the idea that he's quite confrontational against everyone else,
Mm-hmm.
and that he clearly, he's a lot less friendly than everyone else as well. Um, he seems to quite think he seems to focus on negatives a lot, and it makes me wonder, what kind of upbringing someone like that has. So I'm interested in seeing more from Jack and hearing
Yeah.
more from his perspective.
I'm glad to hear
So
that, because you certainly do get some of that. All right.
mm,
Any final thoughts on Chapter 2 of Journalism with the Boys?
uh I really enjoyed this chapter. I'm probably gonna say that for every chapter.
Oh,
We should
thank
probably
you.
get a counter. We should probably get a little counter that says, I really enjoyed this chapter.
All
Count
right.
5.
Fine.
But it was a good chapter. It was short, um, but it was a good character study, and uh, potentially it may set up some key details for future chapters
Ooh,
as well. So I'm
potentially.
excited,
Yeah.
potentially.
All right.
But yeah,
Thank you very much. I love you.